I'm Dr. Robert Bowman. I'm president of the Institute for Space and Security Studies. In the 1970s, I directed all the Star Wars programs under Presidents Ford and Carter when their existence was secret. Star Wars goes back to 1961 and the Bambi program, which stands for Ballistic Missile Boost Intercept. There have been various versions of ground-based ballistic missile defense: Nike, Zeus, Spartan, Sprint, Safeguard. They have a major problem, which is that since they operate in the mid-course phase, the dummy warhead is probably going to be accompanied by a swarm of decoys, and none of the sensors can tell a difference between a warhead and a decoy. They've tried any number of ways, and it can't be done. And against a realistic decoy, I don't see any prospect for that being done in the foreseeable future. That's one of the major problems with that. Reagan's Star Wars is a boost phase intercept system. The idea is if you get the ballistic missile in the first few minutes after it was launched, before the warheads are deployed, then you've got a much easier target to hit. You can see it better because it's got a great fiery tail of the booster rocket. It's far more vulnerable. Essentially, you've got a huge tin can full of highly volatile fuel, much easier to kill than a warhead which is encased in a heat shield. And there's only one ballistic missile for every several warheads and perhaps even hundreds of decoys. So boost intercept is a way to go if you can do it. Now, all the means of ballistic missile boost intercept have been outlawed by the ABM Treaty. Weapons in space, air-based, sea-based, mobile land-based, they've all been outlawed by the ABM Treaty. Even the development of components for these systems have been outlawed by the ABM Treaty, and with good reason. The reason they were outlawed by that treaty is that both we and the Soviet Union understood that these weapons are so vulnerable that they would be totally useless to an innocent party trying to defend himself. They are only potentially useful to an aggressor with the element of surprise on his side. All of these systems have to get within 200 to 300 miles of the booster, the launch point in the other country, in order to do their job, which means if you have a laser in a 747, it's orbiting over the enemy's border. If you have interceptors on an Aegis cruiser, it's just a few miles offshore. If you have a laser in a satellite, it's passing 300 miles over the other guy's territory. So if he wants to send a ballistic missile at you, he is going to shoot your Star Wars system first and then clear a path for his ballistic missiles. Then they'd have an uninterrupted path to their target. So in theory, boost phase intercept is the way to go, but from a military strategic point of view, it doesn't work because it's useless to an innocent party. And that's why it's outlawed by the ABM Treaty, because the existence of such systems would only reward an aggressor for starting a war. And we don't want to do that. The whole purpose of the arms control thing we went through is to make war less likely. And Star Wars does just the opposite. Now, Reagan's strategic defense initiative was Star Wars, was boost phase intercept. It's the same kind of system that was being researched in the 1970s when I directed all these programs. This system was brought to the fore by President Reagan in an attempt to maintain absolute military superiority over the Soviet Union by deploying new offensive weapons disguised as defense. It was then put on the back burner by President Clinton. The money didn't go down. The budget never went down. The spending was there, but it wasn't being emphasized. And then the Republicans in 1997 forced the Clinton administration to accept the National Missile Defense Act, which says that we're going to deploy something as soon as it's technologically ready. President Clinton then reinitiated a ground-based defense, mid-course kind of defense, treaty compliant, because such systems are allowed by the ABM Treaty. And of course, the testing of that system was miserable. The test record shows that even when you put a beacon on the target mock warhead, even when you heat it so that the sensors can see it more easily, even when you do all sorts of cheating that would not be similar in a real case, the thing still most of the time can't hit its target, and certainly can't tell the difference between targets and decoys. So when President George W. Bush was elected, he has essentially backburnered the Clinton plan because of its obvious defects and resurrected Reagan's boost phase intercept, laser battle stations in space, lasers in 747 aircraft, interceptors on ships in the South China Sea and wherever. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on each of these things, about $8.5 billion a year on Star Wars as a whole, plus whatever is in the black programs, and there's always usually as much in the black programs as in the white programs that Congress knows about. When I was director of Advanced Space Programs Development under Presidents Ford and Carter, the Star Wars programs that we were doing at that time included laser battle stations and smaller studies directed at other possible means of doing it. We had the laser weapons themselves on contract with TRW, the mirrors on contract with Kodak and Perkin-Elmer. These were 50-foot diameter, actively cooled mirrors for the lasers in space. We had the electronics for the system, computers and guidance, on contract with Raytheon, and the overall system studies were on contract with Lockheed. So we were doing much of the same things that are going on now in Star Wars. We were also developing bits and pieces for other potential systems, power supplies and fault-tolerant computers and guidance systems and propulsion systems and so forth that may be useful in other aspects of such weapons. The real purpose for these weapons has nothing to do with defense. These are offensive weapons disguised as defense. My advice to the government at that time, by the way, in 1977, in a secret report that I wrote to the government, and in which I used the term Star Wars, my advice was that these new technologies right out of Star Wars might well never have any defensive capability, but they had obvious, awesome offensive capabilities such that any nation that successfully deployed a system would have the kind of absolute military superiority that we had enjoyed in the 1940s. What I proposed was a freeze on this new Star Wars technology. When President Reagan was elected in 1980, everything changed because he changed our national policies. Even before he was inaugurated, the people around him, his handlers, the people that we in the military used to call the lunatic fringe, were making these Star Wars plans. I was even invited to the first meeting of High Frontier. It took place in somebody's living room in the San Fernando Valley. And frankly, I told them it was crazy. Of course, they never invited me back. But they moved very, very quickly to move these things to the forefront in an attempt, as they put it, to steal the technological high ground and to regain absolute military superiority over the Soviet Union. I opposed what they were doing, and I started speaking out in 1981 on the dangers to the United States and to our national security of touching off an arms race in space. I founded the Institute for Space and Security Studies. When I started speaking out, I found that I had less freedom of speech in industry than I'd had in the military. So very quickly, I was on the outside, left the industrial establishment completely, and founded the Institute for Space and Security Studies for the primary purpose of fighting Reagan's Star Wars system and weapons in space. We're still doing that 20 years later. No longer was the Star Wars system a quiet research program to see what was possible and what wasn't possible and make sure we couldn't be taken by surprise. Instead, the Star Wars program became a crash program to deploy offensive weapons disguised as defense. In addition, the overall military policy of which it was a part was drastically changed. No longer were we in the military charged with preventing a nuclear war. Instead, the Reagan Defense Guidance ordered us to prepare to fight and win a protracted nuclear war. This is a policy I simply could not support. And by the way, it wasn't supported by many of the high-ranking officers still on active duty. Reagan's own Joint Chiefs of Staff came to me several times asking for my help in exposing this to the public and fighting what they called this military lunacy. People who say, well, we don't need to worry about Star Wars, they're wrong because, they think, well, it's not going to work anyway. Well, it will work, not as a defensive shield, but that doesn't matter because that's just a smokescreen anyway. Star Wars technology is available for doing the two primary missions which were ordered for Star Wars in 1982 and are still the primary missions for these weapons. The first mission assigned to Star Wars in President Reagan's defense guidance document of 1982 was to destroy opposing satellites in space and seize military control of space. This is an extremely simple mission, one that any number of existing technologies can handle very readily. The second mission assigned to Star Wars weapon by President Reagan in 1982 was to destroy targets on the surface of the Earth from space without warning. This is also something that is quite easily done. The laser battle stations that we were working on in the 1970s could do it if you put enough money into them. The Rand Corporation in 1980, looking at our plans, concluded that before a system of laser battle stations gets good enough to be really useful against ballistic missiles, they would be powerful enough to incinerate cities in minutes, causing the kind of firestorms that consumed Dresden and Hamburg and Osaka in World War II. So what I'm telling you is that the argument over the technical feasibility of a defensive shield is irrelevant because Star Wars has nothing to do with defense. There's a second category of Star Wars weapons that's also very useful against targets on the Earth, and these are the kinetic energy kill vehicles. Department of Defense studies in the 1980s determined that a few pounds of metal properly shaped, fired at the Earth from space, would impact like a meteorite, dig a crater, and at least in theory, be capable of destroying hardened military targets like missile silos and command bunkers, totally without warning. Again, American people have to understand that Star Wars are offensive weapons, not a defensive shield, and it should be argued on that basis. Now, I think the American people won't want new offensive weapons. Obviously, the proponents of these weapons believe that too, because they don't talk about the offensive uses. They try to disguise it as defense. There are a lot of things that Star Wars will do. It will give the hawks in the Pentagon the offensive weapons that they need in order to seize military control of space and destroy targets on the surface of the Earth. It will line the pockets of the weapons manufacturers for decades to come, of course, at the expense of optional programs like health and welfare and the environment and Social Security and so forth. It will drive a wedge between us and our allies. It will set back arms control by decades, with the Russians in particular. It will cause the Chinese to vastly increase their nuclear arsenal. And of course, if that happens, India will be afraid of China and they'll start deploying nuclear weapons, and then Pakistan will be afraid of India and they'll do it. So the whole thing of trying to hold down nuclear proliferation is going to be gone if we go ahead with Star Wars. Star Wars will do a lot of other things too. All of them are bad. Perhaps the worst is that by increasing the fear and hatred of the United States around the world, it will vastly increase the nuclear terrorist threat and will make far more likely the chance that a nuclear weapon will explode in an American city. Star Wars will accomplish many things, all of them bad. It is not just a waste of money. It is much, much worse. If you believe that North Korea or some other country can achieve the advanced technology necessary to build an ICBM, then you also have to believe that they will have the technology to shoot down satellites 300 miles over their territory, or shoot down a 747 aircraft on their border, or blow a hole in the side of an Aegis cruiser off their shore. Remember that the Aegis cruiser was supposed to be invulnerable. They've got this self-protective system with all the radars and all the interceptors, and still the Aegis cruiser in Yemen was disabled by a small boat alongside. The national missile defense tests have been rigged from the outset. They have claimed a few successes among the very many failures. But even those successes don't represent reality. The target mock warhead has had a beacon, a radio transmitter calling out to the interceptor and saying, "Here I am, come get me." They've heated the warhead to make it more visible to our sensors. They have programmed the interceptor to hit a particular target at a particular place at a particular time. We're not going to know any of that stuff in the real case. Usually the target is accompanied by a single decoy, a very large balloon, much larger and more visible than the mock warhead itself. This really is sort of like a homing beacon. It allows the interceptor to see something and track in on it until it gets close enough to see the warhead, which is smaller and more difficult to see. And then the programming of the interceptor says, go hit the smallest target. And so that's what it does. Any real enemy, of course, would put up a whole bunch of identical decoy balloons, one of which would have the warhead inside, and it would look identical to all the rest. We've never simulated that. We've never tried that. They never will, because they know it would fail. Star Wars offensive weapons represent a huge step beyond the militarization of space, which has happened some time ago, to the weaponization of space. And there's a huge difference. The weaponization of space will lead to a vastly increased chance for nuclear war, and more importantly, I think, will greatly increase the real threat to the American people, which is nuclear terrorism. The Space Command's document, their vision for the year 2020, specifically points out that they see the weaponization of space as the way to have mastery of space and through it, mastery and domination over the whole world. You see, this is just an extension of gunboat diplomacy, which has gone on for decades. Vision 2020 and the weaponization of space is merely an extension of that, whereby the multinational corporations would be able to have their assets, their financial interests protected by yet another set of weapons, another set of military missions. The real threat to the American people doesn't come from rogue states or ICBMs, and the CIA agrees with this. They testified last year to the Senate that the least likely threat to the United States will come from another nation. It probably come from a non-state entity. And it will not come via ICBM. The most likely means of delivery of a nuclear weapon into the United States is by non-missile means, according to the CIA, because they're cheaper, they're more accurate, they're more reliable, and they can be used without attribution, which means we won't know where they come from. Now, this is exactly what I've been saying for about 15 years. If a terrorist finally gets a hold of enough plutonium to build him a homemade bomb, the last thing he's going to do is start a 20-year development program to build him an ICBM. What he's going to do is take that nuke and float it up the Potomac River on a barge, or fly it into Miami in a Cessna, or send it into San Francisco Bay in the belly of a whale, or smuggle it into a college campus wrapped in a bale of marijuana, or deliver it to Oklahoma City in a Ryder rental truck. No Star Wars weapon, no matter how much money we dump into it, is going to do any good against a terrorist with a rental truck. One thing Star Wars will do with regard to the nuclear weapon terrorist threat is make it worse. The deployment of Star Wars weapons will vastly increase the apparent military superiority of the United States and the apparent invulnerability of the United States. And because of it, it will greatly increase the fear and hatred of people around the world that we have been mistreating for decades. The reason we're the target of terrorists is because we do hateful things to people around the world. We deny them freedom, democracy, and human rights. We support brutal dictators who will sell out their people to our multinational corporations. So the deployment of Star Wars weapons, by increasing the fear and hatred of our government, will increase the likelihood of nuclear weapons being used against the American people. No weapon is going to stop that, but we can stop it by making it so nobody wants to nuke us. The only long-term solution is to get control of our government and change its ways. Stop it from doing hateful things to people around the world. There are a lot of reasons why people want Star Wars. Naturally, the weapons contractors want Star Wars to go ahead because it's a huge source of profits, billions of dollars in profits to be made on cost-plus contracts, no risk whatsoever. The contractors are the same ones that have been making money on Star Wars contracts since my days in the 1970s. Lockheed, TRW, Raytheon, Boeing, a few others. They have a lot of political clout, and when they give out the contracts, they make sure to spread the subcontracts around to all 50 states, certainly to all the key congressional districts, the districts of all the people who are on the Armed Forces Appropriations Committee and all that. There's a tremendous amount of political clout, money involved, And it's going to be very difficult to overcome that. We need to alert the public to what is really going on so that the decisions are made by the American people on the basis of reality and not on the basis of the hoax, the smokescreen that the government and the weapons manufacturers are putting out for us. The only winners in an arms race in space, the only winners of the deployment of so-called missile defense, will be the weapons manufacturers and, to some extent, the multinational corporations who will have absolute military superiority under which to do all their nefarious stuff around the world and exploit peoples in the third world. Of course, the losers are the American people, the workers in this country that lose their jobs because of the exploitation of people in the third world under the gunboat diplomacy umbrella. The losers are the American people because they are even more the target of terrorists. Ultimately, if nuclear weapons start exploding, the losers will be people all around the world. And even the weapons manufacturers and the multinational corporations that in the short term have gained, in the long run, they'll be losers too. Kwajalein Island has been a major player in the whole Star Wars national missile defense business. It has been used lately to send up interceptors to try to hit dummy warheads fired from Vandenberg. In the future, they're planning on using Kwajalein to send up the dummy warheads, aiming them at the United States and shooting at them with interceptors in Alaska. So the role of Kwajalein will change, but will not diminish. It may even increase. This has, I think, been an unfortunate thing for the Marshall Islanders because it has caused a great deal of pollution on some of their islands, particularly Kwajalein, and it has disrupted their whole social system. It's a shame. The new national missile defense sites in Alaska are planned in order to be a base for interceptors which can shoot at either test missiles coming at the United States or potentially at real warheads coming at the United States. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 said that space should be for peaceful purposes only and for all mankind. It hasn't quite turned out that way, but the Pentagon has continually said that the kinds of weapons that they want to put out in space are not weapons of mass destruction, they're weapons of pinpoint destruction. So they don't count, they don't violate the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And they said, well, we are doing it for peaceful purposes because they're merely defensive, which happens not to be true, but nonetheless it's the claim. So they've pretty much gotten a free ride with regard to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. But the ABM Treaty is another matter. The ABM Treaty, the whole purpose of the ABM Treaty is to prohibit a national missile defense. That's what it's supposed to do. And it does that by prohibiting specific things. It absolutely prohibits anti-ballistic systems in space, in the air, at sea, or mobile land-based. It even prohibits the development of components for such systems. It prohibits even the permitted land-based system except for one system in the United States and one in Russia. It's important that we maintain the ABM Treaty because the ABM Treaty protects innocent parties. The ABM Treaty prohibits systems that would reward an aggressor for starting a nuclear war. And that's why we have to keep the ABM Treaty. It's the bedrock of all arms control. Russia and China and the other nuclear powers are going to feel that their deterrent of the United States is being eroded if we have these weapons in space and elsewhere. And, you know, we will need some kind of deterrence going on, not just in the United States against other people, but the other countries need deterrence because they don't trust us. And I think they have very good reason not to trust us. Mass demonstrations, popular uprisings against weapons in space and Star Wars. I think this was very effective in the 1980s against Ronald Reagan. I believe that if there hadn't been massive demonstrations against Star Wars, we'd have weapons in space already. I also credit demonstrators, civil disobedience, with saving my life. In 1969, there was a massive peace demonstration in Lafayette Park, across the street from the White House. They were demonstrating against what was going on in Vietnam. Well, I was in Vietnam at that time, flying 101 combat missions. And unbeknownst to me, for example, President Nixon had ordered, if there was no end to the war by October, the nuclear bombing of North Vietnam. Now, when this massive peace demonstration took place, he looked out the window and saw those demonstrators, and it shook him. And he changed his order. If Nixon had gone ahead with the nuking of North Vietnam, I was over there, and I don't think I'd be coming back. I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have come back to my wife and 7 children, and there might not have even been a United States to come back to. One of the things that most affected me while I was in Vietnam was Kent State. When I saw our own young men in uniform shooting American teenagers, I knew the war was going to end. It had to end. That was too much. It may have influenced me in a decision I made some months later, because from Vietnam I went back to Korea, and I was in charge of the war plans for 3 squadrons of aircraft armed with nuclear weapons. And I had to make a decision. What was I really going to do if the whistle blows? And I thought about it, and I decided that I would not be responsible for the release of nuclear weapons, even in retaliation, because it would be pointless and immoral. Just because someone had nuked the United States, killed my wife and 7 children, didn't make it sensible to go kill 100 million Russians. Wouldn't bring them back to life. I guess at that point I became what you call a nuclear pacifist, although I'd never heard it. I didn't say anything to anybody. I continued to allow myself to be used as part of the bluff because I believed that deterrence worked. I'm not so sure now that I support the concept of deterrence, but I did then. So I let myself be used as part of the bluff. And you know, I don't think I was alone. I think there were a lot of people at the military then, even though they tried to screen us out and get rid of us, there was a lot of us who, when it really came down to it, we were not going to use nuclear weapons against anybody. What people can do is write their congressmen, their representatives, their senators, personal handwritten letters, not emails, not Xerox letters, personal handwritten letters because those are the only ones they look at. Those are the only ones they count. Very short. You don't have to explain your position. Just put down which side of the issue you're on, because they don't read them, they just count them. And if it's too long or you have more than one issue, they won't know what pile to put it in. But the old standby of writing your representatives is still one of the most effective things people can do. If people aren't interested in keeping nuclear weapons from exploding on their city, I don't know what I can do to motivate them. We have a real problem to overcome, which is the corporate-owned media. They are manipulating public opinion and making it very difficult for us to get the truth out to people. I write op-ed pieces, but because they're too hard-hitting, because they call a spade, because they call missiles, so-called defense, offensive weapons, they don't get printed anymore. They've stopped printing them. We've got a real problem to overcome, and we have to do it one-on-one if necessary, talking to people, educating people, emailing each other, spreading the word, relatives, friends, people we work with, to combat this and to let them know that Star Wars is not just a waste of money. It's worse than that. It's something they should be worrying about and working on. I'm optimistic that in the end we'll be able to succeed at this. I remember the first president I served under in the military was Dwight Eisenhower. And he said one of these days the people are going to want peace so much the government's going to have to get out of their way and let them have it. Our government says that it has to prepare to fight a war in outer space. Well, if we prepare for a war in outer space and put weapons in outer space, probably other people will put weapons in outer space, and we, by gosh, will have to fight a war in outer space. But if we don't, we won't. The fact is, no one else is going to take the initiative and put weapons in space if we don't. What we need to do is to have a treaty which expands the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and prohibits all weapons in space. I proposed this to the United Nations in 1982. It's being proposed again. This is the direction we need to go. The long-term prospects for nuclear disarmament do not look good if we go ahead with Star Wars. Going ahead with Star Wars is going to mean that nuclear reductions will come to a halt and perhaps reverse. We must stop Star Wars and then proceed toward the abolition of nuclear weapons. We just don't have to do it. Only if we start it will there be war in space.